Hey there, if you're new, I'm Callum. I study architecture at the University of Cambridge at Trinity Hall. I've just finished my first year, and in this video I'm going to actually show you a presentation of one of my projects, as I would have had to present it to actual critics, actual architects at university over the course of this year. Basically, the brief for this term is called No Man's Land, and it is studying the architecture of an abandoned town. We had to imagine a research team was going to our abandoned town and was researching something, so we had to design like a temporary base there for them to live in, and we had to come up with what they were researching and how the architecture of the place that we designed for them would cope with that. So, without further ado, I'll crack on with the actual project. My No Man's Land was called Pitcher in Oklahoma. It's an old abandoned lead and zinc mining town that, thanks to the waste products of the mining, became very, very toxic, such that people suffered from lead poisoning, and eventually the town was entirely evacuated, and then a tornado also came through and destroyed the few remaining buildings. So, beginning with site survey drawings, I was looking at the site in plan, and what immediately struck me as being interesting was this grid structure, the perfect 1 mile squares that seem to go across the whole of America, and how imposing they are. I thought it was really interesting looking at the history of the site in terms of man coming in and setting up this mining technology and gradually destroying the landscape, which is almost synonymous with how the grid structure is so rigid and also destroys the landscape as well. Within this plan then, I chose this one location here where the road curves slightly for my specific site where I'm going to put my proposal. Reason being, it's one of the few places where the grid structure actually breaks down, but also you can see old debris from the mining as well here, and you can see how much rubbish is just strewn across the entire site and how desolate it really is. I thought it was quite interesting. Then I cut this plan diagonally to produce a section showing the link between the mining underground, the geology, and the surface, and the so-called chat piles here, which are these huge piles of the remnants of the mining waste on the surface. You can see some of the mines here and how some of them have been filled in part of a restoration process, and some of them haven't. Instead, they've been filled with water over time and have started to sink in. So, having looked at it in 1 to 10,000 and also in 1 to 500, I then wanted to continue to look further in at closer scales. That I then chose to study a specific individual building in 1 to 50 scale as a model to explore the textures of destruction and how the building's been destroyed. I think it's really interesting to read the history and the decay of the site through this building. And then thinking more about narrative, thinking about the history, I produced a watercolor storyboard to show how the site decayed over time, and that sort of thinking then helping me to imagine how it could continue to decay in the future. And this allows me to arrive at a point where I'm imagining and exaggerating what happens with the town in the future. So imagine what happens if the mines continue to fill with water, continue to cave in, there are sinkholes everywhere. What happens if the lead contaminated water bubbles up through these sinkholes in the ground and starts evaporating into the air, and the air becomes toxic? What happens if Pitcher becomes totally uninhabitable? You can't step outside without being in serious danger. So this allows me to come to my proposal, what I want to do with my research team, which is investigating how to sustain human life in an otherwise uninhabitable environment. In other words, surviving the apocalypse. So from this, how does this apply to my architecture? Well, I came up with this hexagonal structure as such, space station style, that is hermetically sealed from the outside, from the toxic of the outside world. The entire thing is covered in an exoskeleton for strength as such, and it's arranged in a regular hexagon formed out of the super strong regular triangle shapes. The proposal is essentially a circumferential ring of defense. So in the middle we have the key hub, the core of the building, which has the kitchen, where this is where the crew eat, sleep, there's first aid, food stores and life support in the middle, and then on the outside there are slightly more superficial functions: gym, a sort of full medical center, a farm to extend the lifespan of the mission, etc, etc. Looking at section, you can see how much more important the hub is than the outside ring. The outside ring is effectively a sort of a defense mechanism as well, in case the worst happened and bits of the mining debris was being flung around by tornadoes. The outside ring can become almost sacrificial in order to protect the inside ring. Looking at the hub in section, there are 4 floors, life support at the bottom, kitchen, social, etc. on the second floor, all of the bedrooms where the crew sleep, and then a weather lookout station at the top. The bedrooms then are all identical. They're all individual cells with ensuite bathrooms, such that again, if one of the 6 was destroyed, the other 5 remain structurally intact, and you could survive in any one of these by itself is the idea. Looking at this idea of modularity and how each one is exactly the same, I then wanted to model just one of them as well, again in scale 1 to 50 here, and that looks a bit like this. You can see the triangle that governs the rest of the design is also in the floor here too. And reflecting the rigid grid structure that governs the landscape of Pitcher, my design has a similarly rigid geometry of hexagons that governs it as well. Thank you so much for watching that. Normally at this point the critics would ask me questions about my project. If you want to ask me questions about my project, fire them down below and I'll try and answer them. So I hope that's given you a bit of an idea of what first year architecture work could look like, and a bit of a better understanding perhaps of the format in which we work. But I hope this has been useful, or at the very least interesting. So thanks for watching and have a good day.